Nelson Mandela was sent to prison in 1964 for protesting apartheid. He spent 27 years locked up, but by 1994, he was president of South Africa. How did that happen? To understand Nelson Mandela's rise to power, we need to understand what he was fighting against. So let's go back in time, way back to 1652, to the moment South Africa's exploitation began. The Dutch East India Company founded the first European colony in southern Africa. They seized land from indigenous Africans, building farms and enslaving the locals. In 1795, the British took over and expanded colonial rule. Both European powers enforced laws that exploited black South Africans, laying the groundwork for a society built on racial hierarchy. By the start of the 1900s, inequality was extreme. Black South Africans had been forced onto so-called native reserves. This meant around 70% of the population were confined to a fraction of the land, forcing many to move into white-controlled areas just to survive. This was the country that Nelson Mandela was born into in 1980, a country ruled by white minority, where your race determined everything. By the 1940s, South Africa's economy was urbanizing fast. The white minority feared their grip on power was slipping. Those fears came to a head in the 1948 election. South African elections at this time were neither fair or democratic. Only white South Africans were allowed to vote, and they made up just 20% of the population. Everyone else was excluded. The ruling United Party supported maintaining white control, but were open to limited reforms and racial integration. Their main opponent, the National Party, argued that reforms and integration would threaten white rule. They named their campaign Apartheid, the Afrikaans word for separateness. Despite winning fewer votes overall, the National Party secured the most seats and took power in the 1948 election. Once in power, they moved quickly. New laws were introduced to categorize everyone by race, restrict movement and forcibly relocate communities. Segregation had long existed in South Africa, but apartheid enshrined it in law. The result was a deeply racist and unequal society. Everyone was categorized by their race. Over 80% of the country's land was reserved for the white minority. Black South Africans and other racial groups were forced into tiny, overcrowded areas where they were stripped of their political rights and denied basic freedoms. Nelson Mandela was 30 years old when apartheid came into force in 1948. He was already politically active, having joined the African National Congress, ANC, a black liberation organisation, in 1944. Mandela quickly became a rising star, helping to found the ANC's Youth League, pushing the organisation in a more radical direction. He believed direct resistance was the only way to challenge and overthrow the apartheid system. At first, Mandela believed the struggle should be led solely by black South Africans and opposed the idea of a multiracial alliance. But other ANC members disagreed, and over time he changed his mind, coming to believe that apartheid could only be defeated through a united, multiracial front. He was increasingly influenced by Marxist ideas. Inspired by the Soviet Union's support for wars of national liberation, he began reading the works of Karl Marx, Lenin and Mao Zedong. Mandela later said he found himself strongly drawn to the idea of a classless society which, to his mind, was similar to traditional African cultures where life was shared and communal. In 1952, he helped launch the Defiance Campaign, a mass movement of non-violent civil disobedience inspired by Mahatma Gandhi's campaign for Indian independence. The Defiance Campaign targeted specific unjust laws, encouraging protesters to break them openly and peacefully. In June of that year, Nelson Mandela addressed a crowd of 10,000 people, calling for them to join his campaign of defiance. He was arrested shortly after and briefly imprisoned at Marshall Square Prison. The campaign was starting to have an impact. The ANC's membership ballooned from 20,000 to over 100,000, and Mandela had gained a reputation as one of South Africa's most prominent black political figures. The government responded with force, introducing a wave of repressive laws, cracking down on protesters. In December 1952, Mandela was given a 6-month banning order, prohibiting him from speaking publicly and even stipulating that he couldn't talk to more than one person at a time. Mandela and his fellow anti-apartheid activists were continuously harassed, surveilled and persecuted by the government, frequently arrested, put on trial, released and given banning orders. Despite this, opposition to apartheid continued to grow over the years. March 21st, 1960, in the town of Sharpville, thousands gathered to protest South Africa's hated past laws, which forced non-white citizens to carry documents justifying their presence in white-controlled areas. Led by Robert Sobukwe and the Pan-African Congress, the protesters deliberately left their passes at home, a peaceful act of defiance against apartheid. They gathered outside a local police station, expecting a government official to address them. But as they waited, more and more police arrived, including members of the notorious security branch. Then, at around 1:30 p.m, without warning, the police opened fire. 91 people were killed and another 238 wounded, many of them shot in the back as they tried to flee. News of the massacre sent shockwaves across the country and around the world. Protests, strikes and riots erupted nationwide. On the 30th of March, the government declared a state of emergency. Thousands were arrested and the ANC, along with other black liberation movements, were banned. This tragedy was a defining moment for Nelson Mandela. Years of peaceful protest had achieved nothing. Now the state was answering non-violence with bullets. Mandela and his comrades drew a grim conclusion. If peaceful resistance was met with violence and slaughter, then they must embrace a different path to end apartheid. In the wake of the ANC's banning and the government's growing repression, Nelson Mandela went into hiding. Disguising himself as a chauffeur, he travelled across South Africa in secret, helping to build a new covert structure for the ANC now it was officially banned by the state. In May 1961, the African National Congress, working alongside the African Communist Party, organised a nationwide stay-at-home strike, a mass act of defiance and civil disobedience. Despite government attempts to intimidate workers and derail the strike, it went ahead and was a success. Across South Africa, factories slowed, offices emptied, and the streets fell silent. It was proof that even under brutal oppression, the apartheid regime could not extinguish the people's desire for freedom. In the aftermath, Nelson Mandela issued a warning. If the government continued to reject calls for constitutional reform, the anti-apartheid movement would be left with no choice but to abandon non-violence and enter into a new phase of resistance, one that would no longer be peaceful. No reforms came, so Mandela began laying the groundwork for a new approach of armed resistance. The idea divided the ANC. Many of its members were deeply committed to non-violence and morally opposed to the use of force. But Mandela, along with a growing number of others, argued that the apartheid regime had left them with no alternative. If they were ever going to be free, they would need to fight. Inspired by Fidel Castro's 26th of July movement in Cuba, Mandela and his allies formed a new militant organisation, Mkoto Wisweze, which translates as Spear of the Nation, often abbreviated to just MK. It became the armed wing of the ANC. Mandela studied strategies of guerrilla warfare, drawing ideas from Marxist revolutionaries like Mao Zedong and Che Guevara, as well as military theorists Karl von Clausewitz. He envisioned a campaign of sabotage, strategically targeting apartheid infrastructure whilst avoiding civilians. The MK's founding document declared, "The time comes in the life of any nation when there remain only two choices: submit or fight." That time has now come to South Africa. Many of the early MK operatives were white communists who helped hide Mandela as he travelled, allowing him to move between safe houses whilst planning MK's first operations. MK operated in small, independent cells designed to limit risk if any members were caught. Their aim was simple: to exert maximum pressure on the government with minimum loss of life. Power stations, military posts and communication lines were targeted, always at night to avoid casualties. Mandela later explained that sabotage was chosen because it was the least harmful form of violence, while still offering a chance of racial reconciliation in the future democratic South Africa. And so, on the 6th of December 1961, MK launched its first coordinated sabotage attack, bombing 57 targets across the country. At the start of 1962, the ANC sent Mandela abroad as a secret delegate to the Pan-African Freedom Movement meeting in Ethiopia. Whilst travelling across the continent, he met the African leaders who were sympathetic to the fight against apartheid. The president of Tunisia gave him £5,000 to help fund the ANC's armed struggle. Mandela also began receiving guerrilla warfare training from other African revolutionaries. The plan was to spend 6 months abroad, but after just 2 months, the ANC recalled him. They wanted Mandela back in South Africa, leading the struggle on the front lines against apartheid. By 1962, Nelson Mandela had become one of South Africa's most wanted men, a fugitive leader of a banned political party and the architect of its new armed wing. The apartheid government was desperate to find him. On the 4th of August, Mandela attended a secret dinner with fellow ANC leaders in Durban. Despite coming to dinner wearing his military khakis, he was relaxed, unbothered by the countrywide manhunt that searched for him. The following day, Mandela set off with Cecil Williams, a white communist and a member of the underground ANC. As they drove through the outskirts of Howick, a Ford with a roaring V8 engine suddenly cut across their path, forcing them to stop. They instantly knew they'd been found. Mandela later recalled that his first instinct was to flee into the bush, but when he looked in the rearview mirror and saw 2 more cars closing in behind, he realised escape would be impossible. A tall, lean white officer approached the car and presented an arrest warrant. He asked Mandela for his name. David Motsamwi, Mandela replied, giving his fake cover name. The officer smiled and replied, "You are Nelson Mandela. I'm arresting you." Exactly how the police found Mandela has long been debated. Mandela himself reflected, "I met too many people for a man underground," suggesting he may have simply taken too many risks. But mounting evidence now points to a darker truth. The CIA likely tipped off the South African police. In recent decades, several former US intelligence officials have claimed that the CIA was monitoring Mandela's movements and passed his location to the apartheid regime. At the time, the United States saw Mandela and the ANC as a potential threat to their interests in Africa. So, the CIA was running an extensive intelligence operation inside South Africa, with some historians claiming that the CIA's operations were larger and more sophisticated than the South African government's. If this evidence is true, then the United States helped the apartheid regime capture and imprison one of the world's most celebrated freedom fighters. Another dark chapter in the CIA's long record of being on the wrong side of history. Mandela was charged with inciting a workers' strike and leaving the country without permission. He was initially held at Marshall Square Prison, and in October 1962 he stood trial. From the outset, Mandela turned the courtroom into a political stage. He wore a traditional Joha attire instead of a suit, defying colonial expectations. He refused to call any witnesses, and he delivered a powerful speech, not in defense of himself, but in condemnation of the apartheid regime. He opened the speech saying, "I am charged with inciting people to commit an offence by way of protest against the law, a law which neither I nor any of my people had any say in preparing." He went on to say, "It has not been easy for me to take up the life of a man hunted continuously by the police, living separated from those closest to me. This has been a life infinitely more difficult than serving a prison sentence, and he closed with a defiant message. "I have done my duty to my people and to South Africa. I have no doubt that posterity will pronounce that I was innocent, and that the criminals that should have been brought before this court are the members of the government." The court found him guilty, and Mandela was sentenced to 5 years in prison. While Mandela was serving his sentence, police raided Lilyleaf Farm in July 1963. The farm, a secret ANC hideout in Rivonia, had been used as a safe house by members of the underground organisation. During the raid, the police arrested those present and uncovered documents detailing the MK's activities, some of which directly named Nelson Mandela. It was a major breakthrough for the apartheid state. For the first time, they had hard evidence linking Mandela to conspiracy against the government. The findings led to the Rivonia Trial. The apartheid regime charged Mandela and several others with 4 counts of sabotage and conspiracy to violently overthrow the government. Thousands of documents and photographs were presented as evidence. At the trial, Mandela admitted to acts of sabotage but denied that MK had ever agreed to wage guerrilla warfare. He and his co-defendants used the trial as a platform to put the oppressive apartheid system on trial. He delivered a powerful 3-hour speech that would go on to become a defining moment in South Africa's history. Here's part of that speech. "During my lifetime, I have dedicated myself to this struggle of the African people. I have fought against the white domination and have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony, with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." The apartheid government tried to censor the trial, but the speech was widely reported across South Africa and around the world. As a result, international pressure began to build. The United Nations, the World Peace Council, and numerous global leaders called for the accused to be released. But the apartheid regime stood firm. On the 12th of June 1964, Mandela and his co-accused were found guilty on all charges. The prosecution had called for the death penalty. Instead, the judge handed down a life sentence to Mandela and 2 others, whilst the others received lesser sentences. Following their sentencing, Mandela and his co-accused were sent to Robben Island, home to South Africa's maximum security prison for political prisoners. Mandela would spend the next 18 years in a damp concrete cell measuring just 2.4 metres by 2.1 metres. He had nothing but a straw mat to sleep on and was subjected to constant verbal and physical harassment by the prison guards. Most days were spent breaking rocks into gravel or working long hours in the blinding white heat of the island's lime quarry. But even in prison, the fight continued. Mandela and his comrades staged hunger strikes and work stoppages in protest of the inhumane conditions. They founded what became known as the University of Robben Island, giving each other lectures in law, politics, literature and history, whilst also holding regular debates. The South African government feared Mandela would become a martyr whilst in prison, so they banned all images of him from being published. They wanted to destroy his influence and weaken the anti-apartheid movement. But the opposite happened. By censoring his image, they deepened his legend. Mandela became a symbol, a living embodiment of the struggle for freedom. In the aftermath of the Rivonia Trial and Mandela's imprisonment, international backlash against apartheid intensified. The United Nations formed a special committee against apartheid to monitor the regime and mobilize global opposition. Across the world, grassroots movements emerged, led by ordinary citizens outraged by the injustice in South Africa. In the UK, the Nordic countries, Canada, India and more, people organised boycotts, cultural sanctions and mass protests. These movements helped sustain international pressure, with Mandela's imprisonment becoming a powerful symbol of the struggle and injustice. Even the world of sport took a stand. The Olympic Committee, FIFA and other international sports bodies began suspending South Africa from competitions. By the end of the 1970s, South Africa was effectively cut off from global sport, a humiliation for a nation obsessed with athletic prestige. Governments also took action against the apartheid regime. Sweden and Norway provided financial and political backing to the ANC. Australia, Canada and much of Western Europe supported economic sanctions. However, not everyone was opposed to apartheid. The UK's Conservative Party, in power for much of the anti-apartheid struggle, maintained close economic ties with the regime. Under Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, the British government vetoed UN-backed sanctions in favour of a policy they called constructive engagement, focusing on dialogue rather than sanctions. Thatcher even labelled the ANC a typical terrorist organisation, which gives you a good idea of how she and her Conservative Party viewed the struggle for freedom in South Africa. To much of the world, apartheid was a barbaric injustice, and Nelson Mandela's continued imprisonment served as a prime example of everything wrong with apartheid. By the 1980s, South Africa was under mounting pressure. International sanctions and boycotts were starting to bite, and the economy was faltering. Opposition to apartheid was growing. The country edged closer and closer to civil war. In 1982, Nelson Mandela was moved from Robben Island to Pollsmoor prison. The government hoped this move would diminish his influence, especially with younger activists. It didn't work, and new movements against apartheid emerged, increasing the resistance against the government. In a desperate attempt to calm the growing unrest, President P.W. Botha offered to release Mandela on one condition: that he renounce violence. Nelson Mandela refused, saying, "Only free men can negotiate. A prisoner cannot enter into contracts." The ANC continued its campaign of resistance, launching hundreds of sabotage attacks in response to a brutal police crackdown. Around this time, Mandela secretly initiated talks with the South African government. He hoped a negotiated end to apartheid might be possible, but the government's demands at that time were unacceptable and did not align with the ANC's vision of a free, democratic South Africa. The main demand was for Mandela and the ANC to permanently renounce violence. However, the government were not willing to do the same. So, the ANC made it clear they would end their violent struggle only when the apartheid state stopped using violence against the people of South Africa. In 1988, Mandela turned 70. After more than 2 decades behind bars, he'd become the world's most iconic political prisoner. Free Mandela was now a global rallying cry. To mark his birthday, a tribute concert was held at London's Wembley Stadium, with an estimated 200 million people from across the world tuning in to watch. In December 1988, Nelson Mandela was diagnosed with tuberculosis, a condition made worse by his damp, cramped prison cell. To aid his recovery, he was transferred to Victor Verster Prison, where he was housed in the warden's cottage on the grounds. A marked change from the harsh conditions he'd been imprisoned in for previous decades. He was permitted regular visitors and even had his own cook. These new freedoms were not just medical concessions, they were political signals. A sign that the secret talks between the ANC and the South African government had been making progress. In July 1989, shortly before stepping down due to ill health, President P.W. Botha invited Mandela to tea. And for the first time, the two men met face to face. They spoke for 45 minutes. No negotiations or formal agreements took place, just two bitter opponents speaking with each other as equals over a cup of tea. Evidence to the country and the world that things were starting to change. And perhaps this was the very moment that marked the beginning of the end of apartheid. Shortly after, Botha was replaced by F.W. de Klerk as president, a shift that would prove decisive. Despite being a lifelong member of the ruling National Party, de Klerk believed apartheid was no longer sustainable. He believed South Africa had to change, or it would collapse. Despite opposition from hardliners in his own party, de Klerk met with Mandela to discuss the country's future. And in February 1990, he made a move that changed South Africa forever. He unbanned the ANC, opened formal negotiations with them, and ordered the release of Nelson Mandela. On the 11th of February 1990, after 27 long years behind bars, Nelson Mandela was finally freed. Outside the prison, hundreds of his supporters were eagerly waiting, along with the world's media. As he emerged into the sunlight, holding the hand of his wife Winnie, the crowd erupted into celebration. A free man at last. From there, he was driven to Cape Town City Hall, where he delivered an impromptu speech to thousands who had gathered to see him. He reaffirmed the ANC's commitment to peace and reconciliation, but made it clear that the armed struggle was not over. It would continue as a defensive measure until the apartheid violence had ended. 2 days later, on the 13th of February, Mandela addressed a crowd of more than 100,000 people at a stadium in Johannesburg. The mood was jubilant, but Mandela remained focused. He and the crowd celebrated his release, but he reminded everyone that true freedom had not yet been achieved. He called for unity, discipline, and an end to violence, urging South Africa to keep pushing until the system of apartheid was destroyed. In May 1990, just months after Mandela's release, he and President F.W. de Klerk reached a critical agreement to end political violence, release political prisoners, and grant indemnity to returning exiles. In response, the ANC officially suspended its armed struggle. A path to a democratic and free South Africa was now open, but not yet guaranteed. More work was needed. And in December 1991, the Convention for a Democratic South Africa began. It brought together the country's major political parties to negotiate a non-racial, democratic future. The talks were fragile. Political violence, right-wing, racist protests, and a deep mistrust on all sides pushed the talks to the brink of collapse. But somehow, the negotiations held, and they eventually came to an agreement. In 1993, an interim constitution was agreed upon, laying the foundations for a democratic South Africa. It recognised equal rights for all citizens, regardless of race, and set the stage for free and fair elections. And so, South Africa's first democratic elections were set for the 27th of April, 1994. Mandela and the ANC launched a nationwide campaign, opening more than 100 election offices across the country. They campaigned on the Reconstruction and Development Programme, a promise to build 1 million homes in 5 years, deliver free, universal education, and expand access to water and electricity. Their slogan was simple: a better life for all. Despite fears of unrest, the election proceeded with minimal violence. Nearly 20 million South Africans cast their ballots, with an extraordinary turnout of 87%. The result was decisive. The ANC won 63% of the vote, securing a commanding majority in the new parliament. But rather than rule alone, Mandela and the ANC formed a government of national unity, inviting former rivals to join in leading the country. A deliberate choice with the aim of ensuring a peaceful transition whilst laying the foundations for a democratic South Africa built on cooperation, not revenge or violence. On the 18th of May 1994, Nelson Mandela was sworn in as the first democratically elected president of South Africa, and the country's first black head of state. His inauguration marked the official end of apartheid and the beginning of a new era of democracy and freedom. It's estimated that over 1 billion people around the world tuned in to watch the ceremony. Once in office, Mandela formed his government of national unity, including leaders from rival parties in key positions. His administration focused on expanding access to housing, healthcare, jobs, and essential services across the entire nation. In 1996, a new constitution was signed into law, enshrining South Africa's democratic values, human rights, and freedoms into the foundation of the Republic. Then, in 1999, after just one term in office, Nelson Mandela stepped down. Honouring his promise to serve only 5 years, he retired from politics, handing over the country's future to its people to decide. Nelson Mandela entered prison branded a terrorist by the apartheid state. Yet 27 years later, he emerged as the most respected figure in South Africa, and one of the most admired leaders in the world. He led with conviction and compassion. Despite decades of isolation, humiliation, and violence, he refused revenge, choosing instead to build a nation rooted in democracy and dignity. Mandela didn't just help end apartheid. He proved that even the most brutal and unjust systems could be dismantled through courage, persistence, and moral leadership, showing the world that a better future is possible, but only if you're willing to fight for it. Nelson Mandela didn't just change South Africa, he changed our world. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like and subscribe for more videos like this.